Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be the inaugural activist in residence. I, I had the privilege of working with Dan Ellsberg for the last 30 years of his life. And when I met him, he was already sort of a legendary figure in the United States for the work that he did in helping to end the Vietnam War. He's an extraordinary person. Beyond his incredible brilliance and courage in releasing the Pentagon Papers, he was just a person of amazing humility, kindness, generosity. He used to sign his letters to people, loved him. And he's just a wonderful human being. It's just a huge privilege to be able to work with him. So I'm particularly thrilled to be inaugurated as residence. And I think it's quite appropriate that the initial activist be someone who's going to be focusing on the nuclear question, because as Chris pointed out, although there were many issues that he was deeply concerned about, the prevention of nuclear war and the elimination of nuclear weapons were unquestionably his greatest concern. I also want to thank you all for coming tonight. I know that you know that this is not going to be an easy conversation we're about to have, and I appreciate you being willing to participate in it. I used to apologize a lot to audiences for the stuff I was going to tell them. I don't anymore, because I've come to the conclusion that with regards to nuclear weapons, we really have only two choices. We can talk about them and do something about them, or we're going to have a nuclear war. And that's going to be even worse than having to think about the subject. So I have basically three messages that I want you to take home tonight. First, that nuclear war is not the threat of nuclear war is not some relevant, something that existed back in the Cold War that we don't need to worry about. It's a real and present danger. Secondly, if we have a nuclear war, it's going to be worse than anything you can possibly imagine, and I will help you try to imagine it. And third, we can do something about it. We do not have to have a nuclear war. So let me begin with the first of these 3 points, the current threat. You know, 40 years ago, in the mid-1980s, everybody understood the danger of nuclear war. It was, if you ask people, what are the biggest problems in the world today? It was number 1 or number 2 on everybody's list, preventing nuclear war. People were terrified. There were movies about nuclear war, there were books, there were songs, there were huge demonstrations, over 1 million people, the largest demonstration in US history, June of 1982. People had nightmares about nuclear war. It was a terrifying time, but the fear that we felt, the awareness that we had of the danger, was very important, positive, because it led to political activity, and that political activity was critical in ending global arms race and preventing nuclear war in the 1980s. And that's a lesson that we need to always bear in mind. We have been able in the past to have a huge impact on nuclear policy. And from that, I think we can take substantial hope that we can do it again. Unfortunately, when the Cold War ended, which was a very fortunate thing, the awareness, the fear about nuclear war essentially vanished. There was, for those of us who were alive at the time, a palpable sense of relief when the Cold War ended. We dodged the bullet. We weren't going to have a nuclear war. The nightmare was over. And people not just forgot about things, they put them out of mind. People were so happy to think we do not need to worry about this anymore. But unfortunately, although the situation was clearly better, relations between the United States and the new Russian Federation were dramatically better than they'd been during the Cold War. The danger hadn't gone away. There were still thousands of nuclear warheads in the world. And there are today more than 12,000 of them in the hands of 9 countries. And they just sort of sat there, waiting for things to get bad and they happen. And over the last decade, a number of developments have all come together to create the current moment we're in, which, according to William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, is a moment of greater danger than at any time during the Cold War. So what are the factors leading to this conclusion at this point? Well, first, and most obviously, they're the state of US-Russian relations. We've gone from the honeymoon period in the 1990s to a period of increasing tension, confrontation, and potential conflict. And I will tell you that Secretary Perry gave that opinion that we were closer to nuclear war than we've ever been in 2018, before the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has made things dramatically worse. So that's the first geographic flashpoint we need to worry about, US, Russia. But it's not the only one. Relations between the United States and China are the worst they've been since the 1970s. There is a clear potential flashpoint for military conflict over Taiwan and over navigation in the South China Sea. And US and Chinese naval forces play an utterly irresponsible game of chicken in the South China Sea all the time, something which could quite accidentally escalate into an armed conflict. There is concern that China plans to try to reunify Taiwan to the mainland in the relatively near future. So another huge potential flashpoint between large nuclear powers. There's a situation in Korea, which has gotten dramatically worse just in the last few months, with increasingly bellicose statements by the North Korean regime that they no longer believe that peace is possible, and a very combative government in South Korea that has really stepped away from the previous policies of South Korea trying to reach accommodation with Europe. In addition, there's a fourth geopolitical flashpoint, which is the one that gets the least attention in this country, and frankly, is the one I worry about the most, and that's the situation between India and Pakistan. These countries both have significant nuclear arsenals. They have fought 4 wars since they became independent countries again in the 1940s. They almost went to war on 2 separate occasions in 2019. And there is low-level fighting on their border in Kashmir almost every day. And it is extremely possible that this low-level conflict could, at any moment, escalate into an all-out war between India and Pakistan. If that happens, it is almost certain this will be a nuclear war. And that will have catastrophic consequences, not just for the people in South Asia, but for the entire world, including those of us living in the United States, as I'll talk about it a bit later. So those are 4 geopolitical flashpoints. There are 3 other things that I think we need to consider, 3 other factors. First is the emergence, the improvement, the growth of cyber technology, which is making the possibility of cyber terrorism ever greater. We used to think the worst thing we had to worry about with regards to terrorism and nuclear weapons was that a terrorist group might get hold of a single nuclear weapon, probably a relatively small one, and use it to attack a city, New York, or Washington, or Mumbai, or Moscow, or London, Tel Aviv. What we now understand is that the far greater danger is that a terrorist group, or possibly a criminal group, or for that matter, could be a state actor, will carry out a cyber attack against the command and control systems of the nuclear armed state, and either directly cause that country's nuclear weapons to be launched, or perhaps more likely create a false alert, trick the country that's being hacked into thinking that it is under nuclear attack, and inducing it to launch its nuclear weapons against this non-existent threat. And this is an absolute nightmare, which is faced by the US forces that are responsible for cybersecurity. They know that when it comes to cyber warfare, the offense always has the advantage, because the defense never knows what form the next attack will take. There are many, many break-ins to US Pentagon computer systems every day, and it is probably only a matter of time before somebody figures out how to break into the system to control their nuclear weapons. Next, and perhaps most fundamental in terms of the threat it poses, is something that we don't often think about in connection with nuclear war, but it's the climate crisis, the other great existential threat to human survival. All of the nuclear weapon states claim that it is their stated plan to get rid of the nuclear arsenals at some point, but that is at some point in the future when the world is safer. The problem is the world isn't getting safer. The climate crisis is making the planet increasingly dangerous. And as it unfolds over the next few decades, which it will, if you do all the things we're supposed to do to try to limit greenhouse gas emission, as the climate crisis unfolds, large portions of this planet are going to become essentially uninhabitable. And people in these areas are going to be facing incredible pressure for basic necessities like food and water. And it's going to cause conflict within countries. It's going to cause conflict between countries. It's going to cause migration on a scale we have never seen in human history, something which dwarfs the current migration crises that are perceived to be occurring in Europe and North America. And if nuclear weapons are still on the table as these crises unfold, they're going to be used. Finally, a circumstance peculiar to the United States is the possible re-election of Donald Trump. And I think we need to, without being partisan, acknowledge the increased danger that this causes. It's the belief of my organizations that the campaign back from the brink, but no one should ever have the ability to destroy the world. No human being should ever have that power. But it is especially dangerous when the person who has their finger on the button shows such a disregard for data, such a divorce from reality, such impulsivity in their decision making. And so I think we need to acknowledge that a future Trump presidency would create an incredible increased level of danger. So for all of these reasons, we have to understand the nuclear war is not a Cold War vestige. It is not a problem that they had to deal with them. It is the greatest threat to your survival and to your future, greater and more imminent even than the climate crisis. And that's a pretty significant claim to make, given how great the climate danger is. But I think you will come to agree with me about that. Let me talk to you next a little bit about what is going to happen if these nuclear weapons are used. Because even as we've forgotten the existence of the nuclear threat, we have very much forgotten what nuclear war might look like. And it's very hard to imagine this, to picture it. Most of you, I think, have probably seen images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They give us some significant warning about the damage that nuclear weapons can do. But the most important thing we need to know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if nuclear weapons are used today. Because if there's a nuclear war, say between the United States and Russia, it's not going to be one Hiroshima-sized bomb on one or two cities. It's going to be many bombs, each 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima, dropped on many different cities. So let me describe to you what a modern attack with nuclear weapons on a large city would look like. I'm going to use a model to describe this. We don't know the exact targeting strategy in either the United States or Russia, but from material that's in open source and from conversations with people who are more familiar with this, it is clear that a big metropolitan area like New York, or a major target like Washington or Moscow, will almost certainly be targeted with at least 10 to 15 to 20, possibly more nuclear warheads. Again, each of which would be 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. It's very hard to describe all these different explosions going on in different locations. So I'm going to use the model of a single very large explosion, 20 megatons, 20 million tons of TNT, 1,700 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The megatonnage in this scenario is somewhat greater, the actual explosive force is somewhat greater than we would expect to see in an attack on, say, New York. The destruction I'm going to describe is actually a significant underestimate, because you cause more damage when you use very smaller bombs and spread them out over the area that you're trying to destroy. But the model, I think, is adequate. It tells us what we're up against. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form, reaching up to 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that nature destroy anything that human beings can build. The blast pressures would be greater than 25 pounds per square inch, meaning that underground shelters would collapse as well. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, having over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, we're talking about 12 to 15 million people dead. It happened. In the case of Boston, 5 to 6 million people dead. And beyond the zone of complete fatality, the destruction would continue. There'd still be hurricane force winds. enormous numbers of fires caused both by the direct thermal effects from the explosion and by the ruptured gas lines, the overturned heating systems, and so on. There'd be hundreds of thousands of people urgently needing medical care with the worst kinds of injuries imaginable. People who were blinded by the flash of light, people who were deaf because their eardrums had been ruptured by the blast pressure, people with collapsed lungs from the blast pressure, people with penetrating injuries of all the glass shards from all the broken windows, people with crushing injuries from having buildings collapse on them, and above all, people with burns. Hundreds of thousands of people with burn injuries. Burn injuries are the most difficult of severe trauma that we have to treat. They require an intensive team, hours and hours and hours of nursing care, special surgical care, enormous amounts of blood products, other fluids, antibiotics, pain medicine. None of this would be available because most of the hospitals would have been destroyed. Most of that personnel would be dead. And the vast majority of the people in the periphery of the zone of total destruction would also die. And if this were part of a large-scale war, not just an attack on one city, but if this was an actual war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would take place in every major city in both countries. And if NATO were drawn into the war, the same kind of thing would happen in most of the great cities of Europe and Canada. All told, something like 2 to 3 to 400 million people died in the afternoon. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure of all the countries involved in the war would be destroyed. All the things we depend on to keep ourselves alive. There'd be no cell phones, there'd be no internet, there'd be no electric grid, there'd be no food distribution system, there'd be no system for distributing heating oil and gasoline, there'd be no public law and order, there'd be no public health system. And in the months that followed this initial attack, the vast majority of people who survived the initial wave of destruction would also die from epidemic disease, from radiation poisoning, from exposure, from starvation. But this is not the whole story. I've just been talking about the countries that fought the war. The rest of the world would also suffer a complete catastrophe because the fires caused by these firestorms that we talked about a few minutes ago would put enormous amounts of soot in the upper atmosphere, about 150 million tons. And they would block out the sun, dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And this would last for a decade. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold since 18,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age. And under these conditions, all the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of the ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. A study that was published in the journal Nature Food in the summer of 2022 showed that a war between the United States and Russia would lead to the death from starvation of 5 billion people in the first 2 years, 3/4 of humanity. And the famine would continue beyond that. The study didn't, but the famine would. That same study also showed that even a much more limited war, the war I referred to, referenced before in Pakistan, would also cause worldwide catastrophic climate disruption. It would not be as bad. The temperatures would drop only about 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, not 18 degrees Fahrenheit on average. But the climate disruption would be great enough that 2 million people, including 130 million here in the United States, would starve to death in the first 2 years. So this is the danger that we face. And we have to understand that this is not the plot of the movie I've just described to you. This is the danger we are living with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. And this is what is going to happen unless we do things very differently than we're doing today. Now, the good news, and there is good news, is that this is not the future that must be. It is the future that will be if we ignore this problem, but it is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It is not as though an asteroid is coming to this planet. It is not what we can do. These are little machines that we build with our own hands. The average nuclear warhead is about the size of a slug that I'm standing. We've already dismantled more than 50,000 of them since the height of the Cold War. We know exactly how to do it. We could dismantle the 12,000 that remain in 4 to 5 years if the decision were made to do that. The problem is that the decision hasn't been made. And that's where we come in, because we have to create the climate, the political force, the movement, whatever you want to call it, that forces our government to take a leadership role in leading us toward free nuclear weapons. And in undertaking this task, I think we can take inspiration from a number of things. First, the enormous success that we had in the 1980s. And I know this is ancient history to you, but you have to understand, in the summer of 1983, the United States positioned Pershing missiles in West Germany with a 6-minute flight time to Moscow. The express reason for doing that was to be able to, quote, fight and win the nuclear war in Europe. It's a totally insane project, but it was the official policy of the US government. And later that year, on 2 occasions, in September and again in November, we came this close to having that nuclear war. There have been other occasions as well when we have come this close to having a nuclear war. Less than 2 years later, President Reagan, President Gorbachev sat down and said, nuclear war can never be won, and it must never be fought. And it was a complete 180-degree change in nuclear policy in both countries that was brought about in less than 2 years' time. And we should take enormous encouragement. We've done it before, we can do it again. Secondly, there is a large movement around the world to put pressure on the nuclear armed states to get rid of weapons. In 2007, my organization, International Physicians that we mentioned in the war, organized something called the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It was a broader coalition campaign to bring in many aspects of civil society. And in 10 years' time, it grew to, we now have more than 10 years now, we've grown to over 800 organizations around the world. The campaign brought about the successful negotiation in 2017 of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, an international treaty which makes it illegal for those countries which are seen to the treaty to possess nuclear weapons, to finance the production of nuclear weapons, to allow the transit of nuclear weapons on their territory, to cooperate in any way with anyone doing it in nuclear weapons. It's an extraordinary treaty and a huge step in the right direction. And it took 10 years from the time we started the international campaign to bring this about. ICANN also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work securing the passage of the adoption of this treaty. Here in the United States, we formed a campaign also. It's called Back from the Brink. It's a model on ICANN. And it has a simple organizing strategy. What we've done is we've created a prescription of what US nuclear policy ought to be. And now we're going around into the whole country trying to get everyone to endorse this prescription in the belief that if enough people do, we essentially create a national consensus that this is what US nuclear policy ought to be. And we're in a position to force the government to consider this. The centerpiece of this strategy is a call from the United States to acknowledge that nuclear weapons do not make us safe. It's a central tenet of current policy that nuclear weapons are part of our security plan. They make us more secure. We call the United States to acknowledge that that's not true. That for all the reasons that I just talked about, they are in fact the greatest threat to our safety and indeed to our survival. And to enter into negotiations now with the other 8 countries which have nuclear weapons for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate their arsenals. We also call the United States government to take 4 intermediate steps unilaterally. And I'm just going to emphasize this first step is not called the US unilateral nuclear disarmament. It calls for the United States to show leadership in bringing about universal nuclear disarmament and to bring the others into negotiations and to have all countries do this together. But we do ask the United States to consider 4 intermediate steps, which it could take unilaterally, which would not jeopardize our security in any way, and which would demonstrate good faith in our call to eliminate nuclear weapons, and would lessen the danger of nuclear war while the negotiations proceed. We ask the United States to declare we'll never use nuclear weapons first. If we at some point make a national decision to destroy the world, it can wait a bit. We don't have to use nuclear weapons first. We call on the United States to end the situation where the president has sole and unchecked authority to launch nuclear war. The Constitution says that only Congress can declare a war. But the current practice is that if the President of the United States gives an order 15 minutes later, the world ends. And no human being is said we're fortunate ever had this time. So we call on the United States to change that policy. We call on the US to take its weapons on air trigger alert. We have hundreds of warheads sitting on missiles that can be launched in 15 minutes time. It makes them more vulnerable to an impulsive decision by an unbalanced leader, to an error in a moment of crisis, or to a cyber attack. And it's crazy. Again, we don't have to blow the world up in 15 minutes. We can do it later. So we should take these weapons off air trigger alert. And finally, we call on the United States to abandon the plan to enhance and modify and modernize every aspect of this nuclear arsenal. The US is planning to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years. So building, maintaining, enhancing new nuclear weapons. We need to be moving towards their elimination, not spending almost $2 trillion, creating an arsenal that's designed to last for the next 50 years, 60 years, until we do it all over again. So we've taken this platform and we brought it to civil society, and over 450 organizations around the country endorse this campaign, including some of the major environmental groups like the Sierra Club, the Natural Resources Defense Council, 350.org, major faith communities in particular at the national level, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, the Unitarian Church, the Islamic Society of North America, the Reconstructionist Jewish Movement, in the Catholic community, the Baptist Christian, they've all joined up in this campaign. Many local groups have as well. We have brought resolutions before local governments, and 20 communities here in Massachusetts, including the three largest, Boston, Worcester, and Springfield, have passed resolutions endorsing this campaign. Elsewhere in the country, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Des Moines, Tucson, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Honolulu, Portland, Oregon, and many others have all endorsed this campaign. It has been endorsed by resolutions passed in 7 state legislative bodies, both houses in California and Oregon, the Maine State Senate, the Rhode Island State Senate, and the New Jersey Assembly. There are resolutions pending in the Rhode Island House, in the Massachusetts State Senate, and in both houses of the Maryland legislature. We've introduced a resolution to the Congress, H.Res. 77, introduced by Congressman Jim McGovern, and co-sponsored by 3 other members of the Massachusetts delegation, Congressman Neal, Congresswoman Presley, and Congressman Lynch, and in total by 43 members of the House nationwide. And this was just introduced a year ago, so this is really doing quite well in terms of the support it's got. And we have just started a new organization called Students of Nuclear Disarmament. It's not college students, they're high school students. They're high school students at 5 high schools across the country, 2 in California, 1 here in Massachusetts, excuse me, 6 high schools, 1 in upstate New York, 1 in Idaho, and 1 in New Hampshire. They want college students to get involved in this. A lot of them are seniors and they want to continue this work and go to college next year. But they also want students today to get involved in this and to start forming college chapters of this organization. So this is the situation we're past. We have a horrible existential threat posed by the climate crisis. The bad news is we have another one too, and we can't ignore it because it is more immediate. It can happen today, and frankly, the effects will be even greater than the climate crisis. We see a path forward. We know that we can fix this problem. And that combination puts a tremendous responsibility on us. If we know that the whole world is in danger, and we know we can do something about it, then there's a real responsibility to do something about it. And that responsibility is on all of your shoulders then. Sorry for doing that. I am sorry for doing that to you, because in an important sense, you had no responsibility. It's not a responsibility. You did nothing to create this problem. But in a more profound sense, it is your responsibility, because if you like us don't take action, then all the things I described are going to happen. I would suggest that there are 2 upsides to the situation. One is that eliminating nuclear weapons is going to be relatively easy to do compared to dealing with the climate crisis. We're not talking about changing the entire global economy, the way 8 billion people live their lives. We're talking about dismantling 12,000 little machines. And the process of getting countries to do this can provide a real model for how we then continue to tackle the climate crisis or the next pandemic or the emerging threats posed by artificial intelligence or genetic engineering. Because it is going to require a level of cooperation between countries that we don't see today. Current model, the great powers are acting like great powers have always acted. They're competing with each other, it seems to come on top. And in fact, one of them probably will come on top. The problem is they're going to come on top of the ash heap that's left after we destroy the planet. What we need to do is to replace that with a totally different model of cooperation between the states. And in the past, when people have called for this kind of change in international relations, it's been framed in moral terms. This is where we should live, people should be better with each other, and so on. I'm not talking from that perspective. This is a matter of hard practical reality. We're either going to start cooperating or to begin. And that's a powerful argument to be able to make to our leaders, but we have to make that argument. So again, this is a much more doable project in many ways than the climate crisis, and it can help us deal with the climate crisis by setting an example of how countries begin. The other aspect of this, and my closing thoughts to you, all of you wanted to do something original. You want your life to matter. Those of us living today literally have the opportunity to save the world. And there's absolutely nothing better than anyone could ever do with his or her life to save the world. And I think we need to approach this somewhat desperate situation with that perspective. None of us is expected to solve this problem all by ourselves. But none of us has the right to step back from that portion of the solution which is for us to do. And if each of us does what it is that we are supposed to do, if each of us figures out what our role is, what contribution we can make to this effort, I am very confident that we're going to solve this problem. And then someday in the relatively near future, we're going to look at ourselves in the mirror and say the truth. I help save the world. And I'll tell you that's going to be a really good thing. So thank you very much for coming tonight, for listening. I hope you'll have a really good conversation about what we can actually. Thank you.
Eric has a microphone. If you have questions, raise your hand and I'll bring it to you.
And we're welcoming questions about the substance I talked about and also comments and reactions. And usually it takes about a minute or so, nobody looks at the hand that wants to talk. So get over the minute fast and start talking, please. Yes.
Right, every.
We get my program.
Thank you. My son told me about the movie, about I did go to Nagasaki, Hiroshima during the 50th anniversary of that event. And that was the most powerful experience I've ever experienced, seeing ground zero, children at that point were just singing songs, these young school children around ground zero. And it was so powerful hearing, Japanese, these nursery rhymes and songs. It was really, and then the people that I met, as an American or from the US, as an emissary of peace, wanting to sleep in the park, family taking me in, bringing me in, and I didn't feel this like anger or hatred towards me, whatever that meant. My experience is just the reassurance of no more Nagasaki, no more Hiroshimas. We can't repeat this atrocity ever, as humanity. And it was just a loving, kind of embracing kind of experience. And so how do we learn from, my question is just, my son saw the movie, the recent movie about the bomb dropping, a Hollywood movie, Oppenheimer, yeah. Like, is that a positive message for the world to get on board with a message of peace? Or is it kind of, bomb to end all wars in World War II?
The movie Oppenheimer, the question was basically, what about Oppenheimer? It's performed a small good. It has engendered some conversation about the nuclear threat. It hasn't told the story that needs to be told. It focused on what happened in the 1940s and 1950s, focused a lot on Oppenheimer's personal moral struggles. What we really need is a movie today like The Day After. How many people here have seen The Day After? So just a very, very small number. The Day After was a TV movie that was broadcast on ABC in 1983 that depicted a nuclear war. And it was very realistic. It did not talk about nuclear winter and nuclear famine because we didn't know about those things yet then. but it was a very, very good depiction of the immediate effects of the nuclear war. And it was seen by 106 million people. It's the largest television audience in American history. It was a 2-month phenomenon. A month before the screening, there was an intense national debate as to whether this should be shown on broadcast television, because kids are going to see it. And I just recently actually saw for the first time on a debate between Henry Kissinger saying we must not show this movie, it will scare people, and Robert McNamara saying no, people have a right to know what's going to happen if we use these bombs. And the debate went on for about half, and the movie was shown too. That movie had an incredible impact. It had an impact on the public, it had an impact on Ronald Reagan. It came out in the summer that he was putting these commercial missiles in Europe, and it played a major role in changing his thinking about nuclear war. Because, you know, part of the problem is people, decision makers, it's quite frightening, but it's also true. The decision makers don't know the stuff that I just told you about. When we meet with decision makers, they have no idea about nuclear famine, almost no idea about nuclear winter, and they really don't understand the immediate effects of nuclear war either. And it's at two levels. I mean, they literally don't know it intellectually, but even the handful of them who do understand it intellectually, they have trouble getting it, like we all do. I mean, when I just told you that, this is really hard to put your arms around. I get thoughts like this all the time. I know exactly what's going to happen with this nuclear war, and I know we're going to happen if we don't do something different. I know that, but I don't believe it. I mean, I just compartmentalize that, go about my daily life as though this were not going to happen. And that's important. We all go crazy if we spend all our time thinking about this. But we somehow really have to strike that balance where we let this information into our consciousness enough that it sits in the part of our brain that motivates our behavior without overwhelmingness. And that's, I think, the power that movies can have. Oppenheimer, unfortunately, did not have anything like that impact, and it's regrettable. The person who made the movie the day after, the director, Nick Meyer, has spent the last 9 years trying to convince a major studio to let him make a day after equivalent today, a movie that would tell the story to today's viewers about what will happen in nuclear war, including nuclear winter and nuclear famine. And he cannot get any of the studios to support this idea. And that's part of the problem. The popular culture is not reflecting the danger that we're in the same way they did back in the 80s. And that popular culture played a very major role in mobilizing people, in energizing them, motivating.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, do you think that the use of the nuclear bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki were warranted, given that they stopped quite rapidly the war crimes that were being committed by Japanese forces against civilians across East Asia and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it's a very widespread feeling that the belief that the weapons helped to stop the war. In fact, the historical record really refutes that pretty resoundingly. The Japanese were frantically trying to surrender. They were going through the Swiss, they were going through the Russians, the Soviet Union hadn't entered the war yet. And they were frantically, in the days just before the dropping of the bomb at Hiroshima, trying to surrender. They were really frantically trying to surrender after the bomb at Fort Nagasaki. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that we did not need to drop the bombs. The war was over. Which raises the question, why did we drop the bomb? And the answer that I think is given by most people looking at this question is we dropped the bomb not as a weapon against Japan, but as a weapon against the Soviet Union, to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that we were prepared to be utterly ruthless, and they better back off. And they just entered the war, and we're moving into Manchuria, they better back off there, they better watch their step in Europe, because we were capable of doing really horrible things, and we have a weapon to do it. I mean, there's controversy about this, but that's my take on this. And I think that the historical record really supports that reading of it. And the final point is, even if it had made sense to use the nuclear weapon in that situation, but why the country had nuclear weapons and nobody else did, that does not inform the conversation today. Because again, if nuclear weapons are used today, it's not going to end the war. It's going to end humanity.
Thank you. So my question kind of follows up on your point about popular culture. So seems to me that if there were significant sectors of the US elite who were really opposed to nuclear weapons and really concerned about nuclear weapons, that those kinds of films would get made. And my question is, do you see significant mobilization from any segment of the US elite? Because, I'm all on board with the mass movement. We need a mass movement, and that's what we in this room can do. But in terms of sectors of the ruling class who actually have power to, more directly influence what the government does, if they decide to use that power, are there sectors that it would make more sense for us to target with our pressures? In addition to the logical, target politicians.
I think appreciation of the danger is really wanted amongst the US elite. They should all be working to get rid of nuclear weapons because they're all gonna die too. And they like to think they have a lot. And so that means they have a lot at stake. And there does not seem to be that kind of understanding of this. And I think it's for several reasons. One is simply the fact that we have been most people even closer to my age than to your age. And we kind of made a collective decision in 1990 that we weren't going to worry about this anymore. That nuclear weapons were just something we didn't have to worry about. And this hasn't permeated our consciousness to some degree. There are also important segments of ruling elites in this country that want us to have nuclear weapons. The possession of nuclear weapons is defended publicly that we need these to deter other countries that have nuclear weapons. And that is one of the roles that nuclear weapons play. But that's not the only reason why we have a nuclear arsenal. We have a nuclear arsenal so that we can bully and threaten the rest of the world, just like the Russians are bullying and threatening the world over Ukraine. And the US has done the same thing in the past. But we threatened to use nuclear weapons against China twice in the 50s before they had nuclear weapons. We planned to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. The plan was called off because President Nixon was frightened at the prospect of the reaction that the anti-war movement would be able to generate if he did use nuclear weapons. We threatened to use nuclear weapons during the Iranian Revolution in 1978. We threatened to use nuclear weapons during both of the Gulf Wars in 1991 and again in 2003. They're very powerful weapons. And they're kind of like the ring of power. People who have them, they don't want to give up that power. They make, as society as a whole does, the false equation between power, strength, and safety. And that's part of the message we need to bring to them as well as to everybody else. That in this case, strength does not equal safety. It's a tough lesson because in much of human history, that probably was true. If you had bigger weapons than your enemies, you were safer. And I think we feel this in our daily life. I mean, if I'm walking down the street and it's dark out and somebody's walking towards me and I don't know who they are and I'm alone on this isolated street, if I perceive that I'm bigger than that person, or perhaps if he's carrying a stick and I'm carrying a bigger stick, I feel safe. But if the stick I'm carrying is explosive and it's going to blow me up if I use it, then the stick isn't made me safe. And that's the situation today. These weapons are so powerful that if we use them ourselves, we will destroy ourselves. A totally successful attack against an enemy. Not a single bomb gets through to the United States. The climate disruption will destroy our country. And that fundamental change in the relationship between weaponry and safety has just not sunk in to the US ruling class or to the Russian or the Chinese or anybody else. And so the message, I think, therefore, becomes really quite the same to them as to everybody else. We need to have them understand how likely it is that these weapons are going to be used. And we need to have them understand what's going to happen if they are used. And that did happen to a significant degree in the 80s. Again, we weren't able to get through the ruling class. They sat down with the Russian leadership and out of a mutual concern that we not blow ourselves up. Totally changed the nuclear policy. So we both identified a remaining obstacle, but also I think the path to deal with that obstacle.
How do we specifically appeal to those with high investments in or huge economic interest in nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be terribly successful in that, with that segment of the population. I think we should probably spend a lot of time and energy trying to convince them. Again, the good news here is that the nuclear industry, although quite powerful, it's about 30, depending how you look at it, between 30 and $50 billion a year goes to the companies that produce nuclear weapons. That's a big chunk of money, and it gives them a lot of money to lobby, and they spend a lot of money on lobbying. But it's a tiny portion of the total economy. And again, there's a real difference here between the enormous power that utilities and the fossil fuel companies have in the debate over climate change. This is a very small segment of the economy that is benefiting from the nuclear energy thoughts. And everybody else is being put at risk for their benefit. And I think the way we approach them is we make the same arguments, but our expectation is low that they're going to respond. And so it's more a question of trying to persuade the rest of society that they need to divest from these companies, that they need to isolate these companies. And a major part of the international campaign for abolish nuclear weapons work is a campaign called Don't Bank on the Bomb, which focuses on trying to make the manufactured nuclear weapons pay a financial price for their activity, to penalize them, to get people to withdraw their investment, to get banks to withdraw their financial support in the form of loans and lines of credit and so on. And that is, I think, the way to approach that segment of the economy. These people are going to be the very last to realize this is a mistake.
We've got a question from Jean who's watching the webinar, basically wanting to know what students can do to educate the public and work for the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I know you're going to be giving a workshop on Thursday night, going into more detail about that sort of thing, but maybe you could briefly address that.
Yeah. I mean, that is really the question I want to talk to you guys about today. What are you thinking about it? What can you do? And there's a lot. You know, we have this campaign back from the break, and the strategy is reaching out and getting communities to join it. We want individuals to as well, but it's really their focus in this of bringing communities together because there's more power there. So there are organizations on this campus, for example, that could formally join the Back from the Break campaign and take a position in support of a policy platform. There's a student government here that could take that position. The town of Amherst has already passed a resolution, and our congressman here in Amherst, Jim Government, is one of the he is the major leader in Congress on this issue. But you come from across the state, maybe from other states as well. You have other members of Congress whose constituents you are. You can work with the campaign, the local campaigns in those areas to get your representatives in Congress to support HR 77. But the other piece is the education piece. This is an issue on which people of your generation basically have not been given the information. And the movement against the war in Vietnam, the early movement against nuclear weapons in the 80s, the driving force was educational efforts, organizing teach-ins, getting arranged for screenings of some of these movies. The day after it's available. You can get that and you can arrange a screening for you know a club that you belong to or in your dormitory. And basically just getting the word out. On Thursday evening, at 7 o'clock, we're going to be having a workshop, which is just to be a more focused discussion about very specific things that UMass students can do. And hopefully I hope you will all come and bring your friends as well and come with ideas about what you can do, because I'd like this to be a working session where we actually make some plans for how we're going to get student government to endorse this campaign, how we're going to get 5 members of the Massachusetts congressional delegation who have not co-sponsored HR 77 yet to do that, how we're going to get Senator Markey and Senator Warren to introduce a companion resolution in the Senate, and so on. So yeah, I think I'd leave it at that for right now, except I would ask you if you have thoughts about how you can get involved. Please share them so we can get it out of the table. and make you a part of the conversation between now and Thursdays when.
How many people live in Massachusetts?
So. Strong majority. How many people live in Congressman Keating's district? Anybody? Congressman Jahan? Congresswoman Clark, Congresswoman Clark? Congressman Akifas? They're the people that have not signed on yet to this. We are in conversation, Congressman Bolton, Congressman Bolton. We really would want to reach out to them. We want constituents to reach out to them and try to get them to take part in this. We're not expecting HR 77 to pass the session of Congress. It's probably going to get a vote, given the utterly dysfunctional nature of the Congress at the moment. But it's an organizing tool to draw attention to the issue, to educate members of the Congress, and to identify champions in the Congress, like Congressman McGovern, who will provide leadership to the rest of Congress and to the country as a whole. The Freeze campaign in the 80s, which you guys probably remember, but anyway, there was a resolution in Congress around ending the Cold War arms race in the 80s, and its main accomplishment was identifying a number of senators and representatives from both parties who became really eloquent, outspoken opponents of nuclear weapons, and who, because of their position, you have to bully people to get votes, to get attention, to get the word.
Even if you don't have a question, I think it would be great to hear a few of you say a few words about what you heard tonight that was new to you or particularly striking.
Thank you, Dr. for coming. I think something that was new to me that was like pretty interesting was the tension between India and Pakistan and the day fighting on Kashmir's border. I have a friend who's from Kashmir, and I didn't really know how like drastic the problems were and like how it's a potential nuclear war threat. So thank you for sharing.
I mean, that's a situation which gets so little attention here, and it's really appalling because this is extremely dangerous. There are multiple different scenarios in which that conflict could escalate to a full-scale war. And India is much more powerful than Pakistan is in terms of conventional forces. As a result of that, the Pakistanis have a very explicitly stated policy. If Indian forces cross into Pakistan, Pakistan will use nuclear weapons on the battlefield against those forces. And India has a very explicitly stated policy that if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons against its forces on the battlefield, it will retaliate by attacking Pakistani cities. This is openly stated military doctrine of these two countries. It's powder keg. And in India and Pakistan, that is the area where the climate crisis is most likely to precipitate a nuclear war as it progresses, as the Himalayan glaciers that feed the Indus River, which both countries depend on, melt and then dry out. There's going to be unbelievable competition for that water. And it is really hard to imagine that that does not spill over into conflict. That's the problem that needs to be addressed in its own, because even if it's a conventional war, it will be terrible. But clearly, the nuclear weapons have to be gotten off the table. We need to figure out how to do that.
What else? Please.
You were saying how we can be able to like get the weapons off the table. I'm from India, and going there last summer, I realized there's a really strong nationalism and patriotism for the country. And for a long time, like India and Pakistan have been like conflict with each other. And so many generations, like my parents, they think that, oh, we're still like, oh, Pakistan is bad. And like, we're like rivals, like when in reality, like younger generations know that like, that's not really true. And so I feel like the only way to like possibly have talks about having no nuclear is like having like this mentality of like, oh, we're enemies of each other. Like give, I would say like diminished, I like that. I would say.
Fortunately, there is in India in particular a relatively strong movement to try to get the Indian government to move in the direction we're talking about. There's less active civil society in Pakistan exists, just let's say civil society to function like the same thing. That may be true in India in coming years as well, given the current trends there. But yeah, you know, this is going to require a change in the way people think about each other. But we've seen that happen. Germany, France, were very eminent, right? They find Franco contribution about World War I, World War II. And by the 1950s, they were close allies of NATO. The United States and Russia, it's gone both directions, but there was a period of time after the end of the Cold War when Russia was at right. There was a period of time between 1980 and the last 10 years when the US and China were friends. And so I think it's reasonable to expect that could happen again. And interestingly, the ending of the Cold War arms race in the 1980s was the engine that drove that rapprochement between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was identified as the key problem. That's where the negotiations took place. And as they worked out the problems about the nuclear arsenals, they sort of discovered we can talk to each other, we kind of like each other. And, you know, by the end of the decade, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, the Soviets didn't feel that they needed to do what they had done in previous defections from the Warsaw Pact in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. So again, the negotiation field of nuclear weapons, the overwhelming shared interest that all peoples have in achieving this, can help to bring us together in ways to come together to deal with all of our problems.
Question. Heard from David online who says he didn't mention the danger of the war in the Middle East escalating into regional or global nuclear war. What is your thinking about that danger?
Yeah, I mean, that actually is a fifth geopolitical area that we need to worry about. I think it's much less likely to lead to nuclear war if it remains a regional conflict than the others that I talked about. But it certainly escalated into a global war that draws in superpowers. And it's a terrible disaster in its own right. And it certainly does provide yet another potential pathway to nuclear war.
I have the same question.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or how plausible do you think it is to get rid of all nuclear weapons and say all countries are successfully are convinced to disarm themselves? How plausible do you think it is to continue to have nuclear reactors, both fission and with now more fusion reactors being studied, to have those as a continued source of green energy without that developing into, you know, smaller groups possessing nuclear arms?
The nuclear power issue is slightly separate from the nuclear position, but they're closely related. First of all, I think what you're suggesting, the question is exactly right. You can't expect to have a world free of nuclear weapons if you have nuclear power plants all over the place. Because the technology involved in running a nuclear power plant is the technology you need to develop a nuclear weapon. And the Israeli nuclear weapon, the Indian, the Pakistani, the North Korean, and if they develop one, the Iranian nuclear weapon, will all be derived from civilian nuclear programs. So there's a real contradiction in saying that we want to prevent further nuclear weapons proliferation, while we as a country actively promote nuclear power plants all over the world. There are a number of other reasons why nuclear power is a bad idea. The most important of which I think is that nuclear power has been burning enormous resources from the effort to contain climate crisis. It's put forward as part of the solution. It's not. Nuclear power plants take 15 to 20 years to come online. We have had 15 to 20 years to wait. They're phenomenally expensive. For the money that we spend on nuclear power, we get much more electricity much quicker if we spend that money on solar and wind and conservation and efficiency. And basically what we're seeing is an extremely successful moment play by the nuclear power industry to convince people that we need nuclear power because of the climate crisis, when in fact nuclear power is making the climate crisis worse. by diverting those resources that should be used to actually fight the climate crisis and do it in a timely and truly way. That's without even getting into the possibility of catastrophic accidents, ongoing radiation leaks, and what we ever do with the nuclear waste, which generate enormous quantities and have a clue how to deal with. So it's really it was one of the most spectacularly unfortunate outcomes that the economy has pledged the countries to triple the nuclear power. That's a lot of money that they're taking off the table that should be spent on getting rid of fossil fuel.
This is kind of related, but over the summer, I watched this long form video about how these organizations are coming together to safely disarm past Soviet nuclear powered submarines, and how they're just sitting in the water as a disaster waiting to happen, and these organizations have taken it upon themselves to put them into places that are controlled, temperate wise, and like the right materials that they're not leaking through. If you have any thoughts on the disposal past or expired nuclear energy?
It's a huge problem, and we really don't have a fundamental answer to it. In the early 1990s, when the Cold War ended, there were all these nuclear weapons that were lying around the Soviet Union. Some of them in storage sheds with padlocks as the only security. So we did have a program then, a non-lucrative bipartisan program to get those weapons under control. And many of them were dismantled actually, and Tony had that fissile material and brought over to the United States and used as fuel in nuclear reactors. But there are still submarines, missiles, warheads, huge piles of radioactive tailings from the mining operations, huge quantities of radioactive waste, both from the nuclear weapons production enterprise and also from the nuclear power industry. And we really don't have a long-term solution. We need to be addressed, we should be spending some of the money that's supposed to get spent on building nuclear warheads and trying to stabilize these environmental disasters waiting. And there are things that can be done to try to mitigate the situation short term, but long term, we don't have the answer. And these materials remain radioactive for a long time. Strontium-90, which is one of the most common and most dangerous, has a half-life of about 30 years, which means you need to isolate it for 10 to 20 half-lives, 300 to 600 years. 600 years ago was like what, 1300. We have just the thought that we can predict now how we're going to safely store something for 600 years. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. We really are supposed to keep this isolated from the environment for 500,000 years, which is it's an order of magnitude longer than in history. And we've created this responsibility for our children to take on with no idea of how we're going to carry that out. It's not just sort of to vent, but to express the urgency or lack of compounding the problem by making yet more of this material in the process of building more nuclear warheads or building more nuclear power plants. By the way, that last piece on nuclear power is a personal opinion. It's not an opinion back from the brain. And we just only focus on the weapon.
Sure, sorry. So actually, two very different questions, if it's okay, inspired from our conversation here. So one is about, I've personally witnessed kind of the power of the individual economic action as part of a broader collective. For example, with regards to climate change, how I and many people have changed their consumption habits, or even in response to U.S. policy with regards to Gaza, boycotting various places. Are there certain kind of industries or targets that people might be able to divest from or boycott or things like that, and it's part of this broader movement? So I guess we can leave it at that question.
Yeah, the Back to the Bomb campaign, you find them on the ICANN website, which is ICANN International Campaign Abolish Nuclear Weapons.org. There's a subtab on the back of on the Don't Bang on the Bottom campaign, which describes in great detail as a listing of all the companies, all the banks that are dealing with those companies, and so on. yes, they are an appropriate target. I mean, here in Massachusetts, one of our largest employers is Raytheon. And it is to me the very top of the list of companies involved in this enterprise. And it's totally appropriate for us to encourage them to invest their resources in other things like figuring out how to build better windows and better solar panels. So, yeah.
Great, that's super helpful. If you don't mind, one more question. You set up this scenario, this plausible and horrifying scenario with India, Pakistan. I'm curious related to the question of the regional war in the Middle East. If you foresee a situation in which Israel might launch a preemptive nuclear strike against a non-nuclear power, and what that might look like, what the risk is, what the threat is.
It's possible. I mean, you know, Israel has made it very clear that it's very worried about the possibility of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. And I don't know exactly what goes on in the lines of some like video that I didn't, but I could imagine at some point in certain circumstances they would consider launching some kind of a preemptive attack. They've already launched a cyber attack in the past to delay that program. They might launch a military attack and it could involve nuclear weapons. I don't think it's real likely at the moment. The Iranian government has made a big public announcement that they have decreased their size of their stockpile of 60% enriched uranium just in the last day or so. I think they're taking that step. I would guess out of the concern that something like this might happen. I think it's a very volatile situation, but it certainly is a possibility. One thing which I forgot to mention is just the website for the Back of the Bring campaign, which is very easy to remember. It's preventnuclearwar.org. And I would encourage you all to look at it. It's got a whole bunch of resources on it. Lists all the organizations that are part of the campaign, and has the sample resolutions that various organizations have passed that could be models if you want to bring the resolution to the group on campus. And just a lot of other links to information about nuclear war and the dangers that are posed. And I do want to invite you all to come to the workshop on Thursday, and I hope we'll all sit up, we'll unplug us together and have a conversation and try to figure out together what we can do. I also, if anybody just wants to talk about this in more depth, I'm going to be having office hours the next 3 mornings from 10 to 12 in early 607. And I'd be happy to have any of you have questions, if you have comments, if you want, you know, references for materials to look at and so on. Please come on, I'd be happy to jump in.
So obviously climate change has kind of been given like a political or has been turned into more of a political issue with different parties like tending to have different perspectives on that. How do you think that partisan bias with like different parties might turn nuclear issues into a political issue, and how do you think that might affect?
It's a great question, and it's a real concern. There's no reason why this should be a partisan issue. In the 80s, when we were misled by Republicans and Democrats working together because they both recognized the nuclear war would be terrible. I am very concerned that this will not become a partisan issue. At the moment, here in Massachusetts, our bill before the legislature has 2/3 of the Republican state senators among its sponsors, but nationally, there's not a single Republican in the House who's sending them a sponsor in the bill. And I think that's partly it's our fault. We haven't worked hard enough to identify who they might be bringing on board. But also when we try to ask, you know, which representatives might be likely, the lists that we get are pretty small. And it's part of the overall problem of high polarization. But it's real dread that Republicans will that this is a Democratic issue, so without even thinking about it, we have to propose it, which would be real tragic if it happened.
Good. All right. Well, I think that's probably enough for tonight. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Very quick closing thought. What is going to happen when you get here tonight is that you're going to start getting the stuff that we're talking about. Not just the usual process of forgetting, but an active oration Because this is really unpleasant stuff to keep in mind. And I understand that, and I recognize this is a normal, expected psychological defense mechanism. Humans do not do that. You've got to hold on to this information, and you've got to spread it to other people, because, as I said at the outset of this talk, we really do only have two choices. We can confront this problem and do it, and I think we can do that successfully. Or really bad things are going to happen, and it's certainly up to us. And so that responsibility is there, and I hope you'll embrace it. But we'll get together and be a party in 5 years for the last year of the warrior. Thank you.